My name's Emma Revel. I'm the External Affairs Director at the Centre for Policy Studies, and this is the Great Energy Debate panel. It will come as no surprise to anyone to know that energy is one of the most heavily debated topics in Britain today. As we were saying just before the panel, Neil, there's been a lot of consensus on a lot of issues at Conservative Party conference. I suspect this is one panel where that will very much not be the case. I'm going to start by giving all of the panellists about 3 minutes to put forward their sort of elevator pitch, effectively, for their vision of the UK's energy future. I imagine we will have a little bit of back and forth between the panellists, and then I will have some questions, and then we will open up for questions at the end. I am delighted to be joined on my right by Daisy Powell-Chandler, who's the Head of Sustainability and a partner at Public First. Dylan Smith is the Energy and Environment Researcher and my colleague at the Centre for Policy Studies. Neil Record is the Chairman of Net Zero Watch and former Chairman of the Board of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And the Right Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former Business Secretary, among many, many other things. I'm going to alternate in terms of opening remarks, so I'm going to let Dylan go first.
Thank you, Emma. I cover energy and environment at the CPS, and we have long been a stalwart champion of conservative ways to hit net zero. So I want to start by taking a step back and reminding ourselves why we're doing this whole thing. The climate is warming, and we are the cause of that. I think that's something we can all agree on. So if we accept that that is a basic premise, the choice before us is how do we decarbonize, not should we decarbonize. And I think the key point that I would want you to take away is that decarbonisation is not monolithic. There are good ways to do it, and there are bad ways to do it. And if we let Ed Miliband and all the lefties have their way, the state will be attempting to insert itself in every aspect of the decarbonisation journey, picking winners and pursuing reckless policies, and we will be sitting with the cost of that. But there is another way. If we take a more conservative approach, set the broad goals, but let markets figure out precisely how to get there, if we go with the grain of consumer choice and maximize cross-technology competition, we can get to net zero as cheaply and efficiently as possible. So my main point would be decarbonisation is happening. The train has long ago left the station. But if you want it done well, don't turn your back on it. Help us fight for conservative ways to decarbonise. And that applies to the power sector as well. Ed's goal of 2030 decarbonisation is clearly bonkers, and a perfect example of decarbonisation policy done badly. And speaking of to the essay question of my energy vision, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I think we should have so many gigawatts of this technology and so many gigawatts of that. We are conservatives. We believe the market should make that decision, not some bureaucrat sitting in Whitehall. So yes, contracts of difference have been a great way to stand up renewable projects. But I also want to see more subsidy-free renewables. And yes, I do exist in this country, although you know it by listening to the lefties. On nuclear, we have clearly gold-plated our regulatory regime. There's a ton we could do to speed up delivery and bring down costs. And I'm guessing the other side is going to talk a lot about the intermittency of renewables. And yes, that poses a challenge, no doubt about that. But we already balance renewables with in our grid today. Over the last year, I looked it up this morning, fossil fuels made up about 28% of our generation, with the rest coming from renewables, nuclear, biomass, and the interconnectors. Just this morning, 9:30 a.m., we are at 22% fossil. And as that fossil number continues to grind down, we will ramp up CCUS on those gas power stations, hydrogen power, batteries, and demand flexibility. We can absolutely decarbonize the grid. And that leads me to my last point, which is also unlike the lefties, I'm not going to stand up here pretending everything will be milk and honey. This will involve some hard choices. There will be costs. But the question is, do we as conservatives stand up and meet the great challenge of our age? Or do we sit on our hands, let the planet burn, and let our children and grandchildren clean up the mess because we didn't have the stomach for it?
Whoa.
Thank you very much. And perfectly on time, Dylan.
Oh, thank you.
So much. Neil.
Thank you, Dylan. Let's start with agreeing. I will agree with one thing that you said, which is that other things being equal, I would prefer to, in the UK, for us to emit less carbon dioxide than more. However, it isn't true to say that the UK is causing the planet to burn up, because the UK emissions, as you know, are about 1% of global emissions. And therefore, I want to apply a simple test to the policy of net zero. Does it benefit the UK population? And is it going to improve the environment if we achieve it? So let's start with the last of those questions. The evidence is overwhelming that the UK is a very small emitter. It has gone from about 2% of emissions about 20 years ago to 1% emissions now. We will almost certainly continue to fall in percentage terms, even if our absolute levels remain the same. The large emitters, they are currently China, India, and the US. Two of those three are increasing their emissions. Whatever we do is irrelevant in relation to the environment. So what we do won't make any difference. It will neither improve or make the environment worse. So the other half of the question is decarbonisation a good thing from the UK point of view? And I generally would like to apply an economic test to that. That is it going to reduce the... there's a local environmental question. Is there a sort of particulate pollution problem like there was in the 50s? Answer, no. Almost all of our generation now is clean in that sense. So the question is it cheaper? Are renewables cheaper? And you've made the case, you are trying to make the case that they either are or they will be. And I would say that we have, in fact, created something of a planned economy in decarbonisation. We have chosen renewables. We have heavily subsidised them. We have, I think, misled the world by claiming that they are cheap. And of course, there's an element which, if you burn gas to produce a megawatt hour of energy, it certainly costs the amount of gas you put in, whereas if the wind is blowing, there's no actual cost at that moment. However, the system implications of renewables are extremely damaging to the grid. At the moment, the only way we can get the dispatched electricity that we want is using gas as the backup. And at the moment, unless there's technological development, and by 2050 there definitely won't be, in the future there definitely will be, the only way we can reach, or the only way renewables will try to get us to reach net zero by 2050 is then by having enormous capacity with huge intermittency, but we'll still need 100% capacity with gas and nuclear. Otherwise, there will be a day, and now and again they happen, they typically, early February, high pressure, misty, 8 o'clock in the morning, no solar, no wind. How are you going to get your electricity? And by the way, that's when you want your 45 gigawatts of electricity at peak. And finally, we have to remember that decarbonising the grid is about 20% of our energy use. So there's 80% of our energy use left, which is almost all fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are doing things which are extremely difficult to do with electricity, like transport. So we know that electric cars have lithium-ion batteries. That's the current technology. They're extremely heavy. They have about an eighth the energy density per kilogram of petrol and diesel. So even if we manage to get renewables to work, we still have to, if we're going to fully decarbonise, we're going to need 140 gigawatts of capacity. And renewables have no chance of getting anywhere near that in 2050. So the policy will fail. It will be very expensive. And my vision, until technology moves on to the point where we can smooth out the intermittency, would be to have a gas and nuclear mix. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. I think we're going to have to pick up a lot in the debate later, because many of Neil's figures, I'm afraid to say, are just horribly out of date. But energy vision. First of all, it's really warm in here. So I want you all to stand up. Everyone, up, 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 up. Audience participation. Right. Now, sit down if you think that the government should do less to reduce the number of murders in the UK. Okay?
Good start.
Sit down now if you think the government should do about what it's doing now to reduce the number of murders in the UK. Okay? Everyone standing up thinks that we should do more to stop murders in the UK. Yes? Right, put your hand up if you know how many murders there are every year in the UK. Anyone want to take a guess? Come on.
It's about 600.
Thank you.
I would say about 300, but...
Brilliant. It's 590.
Thank you.
Well done, sir.
Well done.
You're allowed to sit down. Meanwhile, unfortunately, Neil is incorrect. Meanwhile, 30,000 people die every year in the UK of causes related to air pollution. And most of the air pollution is caused by us burning stuff. That causes a huge stress on the NHS. It costs, in fact, around 20 billion in combined health and business costs in terms of lost earnings and health service costs. So, my energy vision for the UK is that I am rooting for a future in which we build on the incredibly impressive legacy of multiple Conservative energy ministers, including Jacob,
Not
in
really.
driving down the energy bill. No, come on.
No, I
In
stop
driving
that.
down the emissions of our energy sector, and at the same time making it easier and cheaper for everyone to drive a lovely, quiet, cheap EV, to take it home to their well-insulated house that is heated by an incredibly efficient, much more efficient than burning stuff, heat pump that can be charged up when there is lots of wind and then discharged when you need it, that makes use of windy and sunnier moments to get negative price electricity, to get paid to charge that car and use it as a battery for your house, that makes a benefit of the volatility by using markets to drive down costs. And if we keep moving quickly, then there's an added benefit, because we're all capitalists in this room, I suspect, which is that each time that person drives off to work, they may well be earning their money by selling the tech that we are world leaders in, that predicts the weather so that we can optimize the grid, that uses AI to better manage a flexible grid. By the way, the grid was getting much more flexible even before we put the renewables on it. We changed how we were doing gas. So we've been doing this for some time and we're pretty good at it. So we can be out there selling this to other countries. But by the way, it does matter whether we do this first. First of all, because we have an outsized impact on diplomacy in the climate world. And second of all, because if you're seen to do something first, you're much more likely to be able to sell this stuff to other people. Britain led the way into the Industrial Revolution. Conservatives initiated the dash to gas. And now, unless we are blinded by some very strange form of nostalgia, we will stop burning the gas and coal, which, by the way, we are running out of, and we are having to import from people who we do not want to be beholden to. And instead, we will embrace a far healthier, cheaper world that, as a delightful smug bonus, does not ransom the future of our children. The estimates from such hippies as the London School of Economics are that climate change will cost us 5% of GDP over the next few decades. And we wouldn't let Labour build up a debt that did that to our children, so we shouldn't do it to them ourselves.
Thank you. Jacob.
Thank you very much. Robin's point is the absolutely fundamental one, that on the day when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you need to have 100% of your electricity generation from gas or nuclear. Therefore, you have to pay to have a system that will provide electricity on those days, which for 364 days of the year you are not using. That is the cost of renewables, a system that if it were running on gas is extremely cheap and efficient, but if it's used for one day out of 364, all that capital cost rests on one day's usage. And that is the main reason, this gas backup is the main reason we have electricity prices that are more than double those in the United States, and the intermittency of wind means that we can't rely on wind to provide cheap electricity, and then the ridiculous subsidies that we are paying to the wind and the solar and the other people in the renewables field. This is making us fundamentally uncompetitive. It is making us cold and poor. The United States economy has grown much more significantly in the last 14, 15 years, as it hasn't done this, and we have. So there was a 10% gap between GDP per capita between the US and the UK 20 years ago. That has now widened to nearly 50%. We have got poorer because of expensive electricity, expensive energy usage. We saw it yesterday. We lost 2,000 jobs in Port Talbot because the energy costs of blast furnace is so much higher in this country than anywhere else, and then we import the steel from elsewhere, because there is some usages for which you can only use new steel. We will have a scrap steel manufacturing base in Port Talbot. So we're destroying jobs on a wing and a prayer, on an idea, on an ideology. And yes, we may be responsible for some change in the climate, but then deal with it. The climate has always changed and always been in flux. There have been all sorts of variants. There is a period, there's the mini ice age, there's the medieval warming period. What you've got to do is adapt and recognize there are some benefits from slightly warmer temperatures, that there are some parts of the world that become fertile that currently aren't fertile, that more people die each year from cold rather than from heat, so you keep more people alive. And Daisy, your point on air pollution, what really made our air pollution worse? We listened to the government and the European Union. Because what did they say? They said it'd be marvellous to have diesel cars. Why? Because diesel cars didn't put out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It may have an effect on the climate, but breathing it in, as long as you've got a bit of oxygen there, doesn't kill you. Whereas breathing in particulates and nitrous oxides from diesel engines, which the government, the EU and the car manufacturers told us was an important part of being greener, did kill people directly. And that's the responsibility of this green ideology. We are, as Neil pointed out, 1% of global emissions. We make no difference. If you are running a poor country, if you are the Prime Minister of India, are you really going to say that I'm going to put up your price of electricity tenfold to be at the UK price with lots of renewables when you've got people who have no refrigeration and get diseases because they can't keep their food properly? Is that really what you're going to say when you're facing re-election? No, of course you're not. And the Chinese, they may be totalitarian, but totalitarian regimes have to keep their people fed and healthy. Otherwise they find they face a revolution. Are the Chinese going to do this? No. And the idea that we're making money out of technology just isn't true. Who's making all the electric cars? China, so they can then follow all our movements. We're closing down our car manufacturing, so even Italy is kicking back on this because it doesn't want to close its car manufacturing businesses. Did we make all the money out of wind energy, out of building the windmills? No, of course not. So the fact that you get the technology early and install it early doesn't mean you necessarily make the money. If this was all so brilliant, the free market would deal with it. The free market encourages us to move from horses to motor cars. If electric cars were better than petrol cars, the free market would deal with it. I don't want people to be cold and poor.
This is going to be a really fun one to chair, isn't it? I'm stressed already. Wish me luck, everybody. I'm going to let you come back on each other's points, ideally in a very tactful and respectful way, which I'm sure everyone will do. Are there key points you want to respond to, and could you counter the point from this side on intermittency? Because I think with renewables, what people think when they look at Britain is it's not very sunny, the weather is absolutely terrible, and even though Birmingham is doing its best to prove the opposite, it isn't always horrifically windy.
I'll happily take on intermittency, because I think, first of all, I would just pull up the fact that both Neil and Jacob have said, when there is zero wind and sunshine, we don't have solar eclipses very often, and this is the UK, it's mostly windy.
We have night time most days.
We do have night time, most days.
I know, but also we use the least power overnight. Also, utilisation of gas power is nowhere near 100%. So this is all based on a set of really false premises. The likelihood of us falling to 0% is zero. And in fact, as I mentioned, we're already pretty good at balancing the way intermittents flow into our system. One of the things that had happened well before renewables were a prominent part of our system is that gas power stations had got a lot smaller and a lot more geographically diverse. So the electricity system was already having to become a lot more flexible, and that's what has actually been smoothed out a lot by renewable, because quite often it isn't all down at once. That's one reason why diversity of supply is really important, and it's one reason why it's great that we're moving more renewables out into the Celtic Sea, because, interesting fact, energy nerds out there, the wind in the Celtic Sea is actually counter-correlated with the wind in the North Sea. So if you have wind turbines in both, you actually counter a lot of the intermittency. One of the things that's also been happening a lot recently, and one of the things that we know about wind turbines and solar panels, for example, that the technology has advanced hugely over the last decade. And the same is also true of storage technology. So the queue of battery projects in the sign-off queue at the moment is actually much larger than we would need to manage the intermittency by 2030, even if we manage to hit the 2030 targets, which, by the way, are the same as the ones that we set.
Can I pick, well, if you guys want to talk about intermittency, but I'd love to talk the sort of mitigation adaptation point in the one.
Could I pick up on storage? I mean, intermittency is a fundamental problem for renewables. They aren't, by the way, as we know, the only zero carbon producer. That's nuclear. Nuclear has a major issue in the UK, that it's extremely expensive. At the moment, we have to subsidise it heavily. We've only got one major project on the go. It's taken 20 years to get this far. There's probably another 5 years to go. It's very good for base load. It's not particularly good at altering the natural cyclical demand for energy. But I would say if you're interested, if you really think that our emissions are critical in the electricity grid, we should spend more time and money on nuclear. The storage issue, I think, is absolutely fundamental on renewables. There is no battery technology which we can use at grid scale which will power the UK grid. It is vital because we are becoming increasingly electrified. The tech that we rely on, even in your home, without electricity, even if you're gas-powered central heating, without electricity your house is cold because you can't use the pump and the technology. So not having power cuts is critical.
I think we can all agree on that one.
No world in which we'll have power cuts.
It may be that I didn't exaggerate, because you can find in the historic record some points where there is rounding zero electricity from renewables, but quite regularly in high pressure in the winter, there's low input from renewables, and particularly at night and early morning and in fog. And there you need to have a guarantee, and the guarantee has to be enormous amounts of storage. At the moment, the largest battery in the world, I think, is called Moss Landing in California. It's something like 1.8 gigawatt hours. That would power the UK grid for a few minutes. So we're miles off, and that costs, it's about $1 billion per gigawatt hour. And by the way, these are lithium ion, and they're very, very vulnerable to catching fire. And when they catch fire, they're very, very dangerous, because there's so much energy stored in them, which is the same problem with electric cars. So I would say that there's a huge storage issue, and all the balancing you talked about, the balancing is actually largely through gas. And the gas producers are increasingly saying, as Jacob said, guys, I'm not doing this at the prices you're offering because I'm just not using my capacity. So then the government, I say, well, will you sort of stay on capacity if we give you extra money? And here's the reality. Gas prices, which had been relatively stable, in fact falling in real terms until the Ukraine invasion, and then they rose dramatically, have come down a long way. And in the since 2010, in real terms, they're about 75% higher than they were in 2010, largely as a result of Ukraine. Electricity prices are 100% higher in real terms. Gas prices will be coming down, electricity prices won't. Why? Because you are paying in your hidden subsidies as part of the electricity cost all the system costs, and these system costs are getting bigger and bigger, and the more renewables you have, the larger these system costs will become. So there is no prospect of cheap electricity in the UK if we stick with renewables.
Go on.
Lovely. Wow. Okay, many things. So technology, you're right. Gas is the primary thing we use to balance the system right now. That's absolutely the case. Technology will develop. You're right. Batteries are not yet at a place where they could do grid-scale storage and entirely make up for that gas. So particularly in the 2030s, gas will still probably be the balancing force in our grid, though smaller and smaller percentages. The way electricity works is in each it's sort of priced in half-hourly periods. As we get into the 2030s, there will be more and more half-hourly periods where all of our electricity is provided by renewables. Guess how much renewables cost to run on an ongoing basis? Almost nothing. The sun powers them or the wind powers them. When that, if you go Octopus Energy, one of the suppliers, has a tariff right now called Agile, actually tracks the half-hourly movements of the power grid. There are half-hourly periods and sometimes several-hour periods. Electricity is not just nearly free, it's actually negatively priced. So they are paying you to consume electricity. That will happen more and more, and there will be other periods where gas needs to come in and fill gaps. That's absolutely true. But technology is developing all the time. Hydrogen storage, batteries. You mentioned nuclear. We are big fans of nuclear at the CPS. All in favor of big scale nuclear, SMRs. But it's one of those things. If you ask people 15, 20 years ago, would you be driving around an EV right now? They'd be like, no, EVs, it's been tried, it can't really happen. And look, plenty of people drive lovely EVs, as does Daisy. So, technology will not necessarily, we don't know precisely which technologies will win out, but I think it's a decently safe bet that given the billions and trillions of dollars pouring into renewable energy, that this technology will develop and the cost will come down over time. I'd also love to come back on Jacob's point on mitigation versus adaptation, as they call it in the field. So yeah, that's absolutely true. The climate has changed up and down. I mean, temperatures have gone up and down. If you sort of look over the geological history of the Earth, that's entirely fair. And yes, we could absolutely just say, we'll sit on our hands. We will not really do much to stop this. We'll keep burning things. Yes, temperatures will get hotter, and then, not really us because we'll be dead, but our descendants will then clean up, will have to install air conditioning and deal with the crop failures and so on and so on and so on. But I guess, to me, there are sort of two problems to that. One is the straight up intergenerational unfairness point. I don't think it's fair to put those costs on our children and grandchildren because we can't be asked to stump up ourselves. And secondly, if we do that, the costs of not dealing with it, 75, 100 years down the line, the temperature, the climate change will get way worse, and those costs will be way higher. So, I mean, to me, it's sort of a risk management thing. It will cost some money and take some effort to deal with this now, but I think it's far better to put the money in now than let our grandchildren have to clean up the way worse consequences because we couldn't do them ourselves. And yes, we are only 1% of emissions. That is absolutely fair. But I'm going to let you in a dirty little secret. In every country around the world, there are people, like these gentlemen here, saying, we're not really a big part of the problem. In China and India, do you know what they say? We're poor. The UK and the US are rich. Why don't they clean up their stuff? And then eventually we'll get around to doing ourselves. It breaks down to game theory. Ultimately, this is a collective action problem. And I struggle to see the logic of we're going to do less on climate, and therefore the rest of the world is going to do more on climate because we've already gone so far. And look, Ed's policy of 2030 is nuts. We should not be killing ourselves for the sake of lefty green ideology, but we do have to do this. This is the fundamental challenge of this century, and there's no world in which we can avoid decarbonizing.
I just think we don't have to do this. It's really straightforward. We've had all these terrifying doom and gloom statements coming out from the green lobby for years. You look back and that former American Secretary of State said in 2009 that in 5 years the ice caps would have melted or something like that. Well, they didn't. We've had endless stories that we're all doomed. Actually, we've always done this. This isn't something new about human nature. And it's basically psychological. It is this feeling that the world is about to end. There was a huge outpouring of it, of millenarianism in at the beginning of the 1600s. There was a huge amount around 1000. People thought it was all going to end, and that therefore they had to change their lives immediately to make their lives less comfortable. It's always about making your life less comfortable to save yourself. This is for the birds. We really don't need to do it. It is a religion. It's like the Puritans. They should start wearing pointy hats and going around saying, we're all doomed. And about our children and our children's children, yea, under the 30th generation, the thing that will help them most is not that we stop using petrol cars, but that we ruin our economy. Because if in 100 years' time... Now, Shankar Singham was saying this earlier on. If between 1890 and 1980, the US economy had grown by 1% less per annum each year, obviously it's per annum, the US would have been the same GDP as Mexico. 1% per annum growth is what we need for our children and our children's children, yea, unto the 30th generation, because then they can afford to install the air conditioning. And air conditioning, as it happens, has saved more lives in New York in the summer than anything else that they've done. If you go back to 1900, hundreds of people died in New York every summer from heat. Now they don't, because they've got air conditioning. What does that require? Cheap energy. And we've got plenty of it, and we must go back, just briefly, to this intermittency issue, because it's the basic economics that if you have an asset that sits idle and is only used at peak times, then of course the cost per unit of production is massively higher. And that feeds through to all our electricity bills. The most efficient way of running a gas electricity station is to run it as full time as you can with closures for maintenance. And the more you have it intermittent, the higher the cost goes. This is even more true of coal, actually. Gas, fortunately, you can switch on and off relatively easily, but you've still got that capital cost sitting there, which needs a return for the investors. So we are condemning ourselves to being cold and poor. We are condemning our children to being cold and poor, and we will not be able to afford the ameliorations if all this happens. It's not that I deny that carbon has an effect on the climate. Yeah, I'm more than happy to accept that. But people have forecast terrible consequences now for quite some time, and we seem to be jogging along about all right.
Dear
Jacob, I
Lord,
wanna-
if this is all right.
This is
Sorry, can I
fine.
come back
We're
on
all
that?
fine, aren't we? And China's growing, and India's growing, and global poverty since 1990 has collapsed. Why? On cheap energy and free trade. It's simple. We really don't want to put this hair shirt on.
I just want to ask a political question. Given this is Conservative Party conference, Jacob, there are significant factions within the Conservative Party who will agree with you, many of whom will be in the room, but there are also significant factions within the Conservative Party who see that actually decarbonisation is one of the most phenomenal successes that the 14 years of Conservative government have to boast about. How do you think the party can resolve that tension? Can it be resolved, or is this just going to fester? Because this seems like quite a significant issue that the party isn't necessarily tackling in terms of its own unity.
Well, people will have to decide amongst the various issues which one is most important to them. And if it is green issues and the Conservative Party is not a green party, then they might find that the Conservative Party isn't where they want to be. But in all issues we take compromise. There are some things that people in the party say and do that I was never very much in favour of, but they are party policy and you live with that because in the whole pantheon of Conservative views you accept it. But if we are still muttering the green ideology in 2028-29, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to win an election. I think the 4 million people who've gone off to reform will stay with reform because they're actually talking much more sense about this. My concern as an MP was for my voters. What improved their standard of living? What made their lives better? And making their energy more expensive does not make their lives better, it makes it worse. And therefore I think there are no grounds for doing it. I think this is the new socialism. It's about telling people how to lead their lives. The man in Whitehall knows best. We know what's good for you. It's not what my constituents used to think. They thought what they wanted was to not worry when they switched the gas on.
Do you want to come back quickly and then I've got a
Yes,
question
from
for
a
Liz?
political point of view, actually. But to pick up Jacob's theme of history, it's really weird because I thought this was a Conservative Party conference, and it seems somewhat like this is the Libertarian Party, or possibly the Luddites. Because back in 1789, when the French Revolution was going on across the Channel, and it all looked a little bloody for our liking, the Conservatives of the UK decided that it was really important that we avoided revolution at all costs. And also that we needed to show that we were making some form of change in order to preserve the structure of society. Energy transition is happening. You cannot simply break the machines and hope that it goes away. The reason why China is building loads of solar, loads of electric cars, loads of offshore wind, and yes, 75% of the power that China installed last year was renewable. And to come back to Jacob's point about jobs, the coal plants they did build, they're not expecting to turn on. They're job creation schemes, by the way. China isn't doing that because it's a woke hippie state that is determined to commit economic hara-kiri. It's doing that because it wants to win at the world economy. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot argue both that China would not do this because it's too sensible economically, and also that China is doing this.
Well, what I am going to argue about is your history in 1789, because actually what happens is the Whigs split. Edmund Burke was quite clearly a Whig. He'd been secretary to Rockingham. He looks at revolution and thinks it's very dangerous. The Foxite, also Whigs, think that the French Revolution is a great success and we should import some of it here. They begin to change their mind when the terror comes. The Tories, the Conservatives, are completely consistent. They're for church and king, and they remain for church and king, and they don't change, and they oppose reform in 1832, and it is only finally the Duke of Wellington who recognises political reality when bricks are thrown through his window, and he says, well, we'd better do this. So it's not quite what the Tories were doing in the late 18th century.
I thought having James Cleverly here yesterday talking about the Battle of Waterloo was as much history as we were going to get. I forgot that Jacob was coming.
But could I just pick up
Yeah.
on Daisy's claim that there's a Luddite aspect to our thinking, the opposite. There's no doubt that the UK has been in the forefront of technological and scientific advances in the last 200 years. We continue to do that. But what we're doing here is we are creating a mini planned economy within the energy sector in which the government is, inverted commas, is picking winners. And doing that is an anathema to real innovation. For those of you who have studied innovation, and there's a very good book by Matt Ridley on innovation, it's one of those rather difficult to handle. It's a bit like artistic endeavour. You sort of get kind of Florence in the 16th century, and all of a sudden it flowers. And we had England in the 19th, or Britain in the 19th century, and early 20th century was extremely strong on this. For a free marketeer and a capitalist, as I think most of us are around here, what we would want is to have innovation to produce energy which is as clean as it can be and is lower cost. What is absolutely clear, because of the subsidies we know it's clear, and because, particularly actually on offshore wind, we know the subsidies weren't enough last round, so all the owners of the wind farms are not doing it. So, well, we'll just give you more money then. So what we're doing is we're investing in technology which is less efficient than the technology that it's replacing. This is as Jacob said, this is a very strange thing to do, and it will end in tears. And what I'm absolutely clear about is Daisy is wrong about Chinese electricity. Chinese electricity is a quarter the price of UK electricity. There is a very, very little renewables in the Chinese system compared with coal, and coal is the cheapest form. At least the coal that China uses is the cheapest form of electricity generation. And interestingly, because of that, their steel is the cheapest in the world. Not just because of that, they also have cheap labour and cheap lots of other things. But the idea that they subsidise all these things, where do these subsidies come from? They don't subsidise, it's just they have the conditions that mean they are very good at producing these things at low cost. And as a result of that, we have not just decarbonised because we are working hard to decarbonise, we've decarbonised because we're losing our heavy industry. And the higher the increase in our energy prices, particularly electricity prices, the more that'll continue. And Jacob is right, we can only respond to the sort of challenges that climate change, which again, like Jacob, I don't deny, only responds to this if we're wealthy. And this is competitive. So the Chinese are getting ahead of us on this, and the Indians, and actually the Americans, whose electricity prices are half ours, they are getting ahead of us on this. We are getting behind. If we continue with this very poorly thought out policy, I would say almost a religious policy, we are doomed. Just the last thing to say on this, and I'll shut up. I chair a think tank called Net Zero Watch, which is very small, but that's not the point. The point is, interestingly, it debates the technology used to produce electricity and energy for our use. It's not what we call it. It's not a philosophical issue. You can't really claim we're deniers because this is all about engineering. But even today, there is no real debate. So the BBC won't invite me on. Very difficult to get mainstream media to have me talk about these things. And so the great energy debate is not an energy debate, as Daisy said. Decarbonisation is coming. No, why? Why is decarbonisation coming if it's not going to do those things that I said? And I'm very happy, this is my very last point, if we want to do lockstep carbon, so we're 1% of emissions now, if the world decides that carbon is so dangerous, carbon dioxide is so dangerous, and reduces its emission, we should stay at 1% and we'll all go down to zero. Fine, because that means the technology has arrived. But for us to do it unilaterally, it's an economic disaster.
We're not doing it unilaterally.
Just hold on, sorry.
This is just nonsense, isn't it? It's not true. We literally have international treaties that are there to enforce that we're doing this together.
The only people who are doing it are the Europeans, and they're ruining their economies.
And emissions are rising, with the exception of the pandemic. Emissions are now 37 billion tonnes of CO2 a year. And my guess, you can test me, I'll probably be dead by then, in 2050 they'll be higher than they are today, not lower.
I was looking this up, actually. China's emissions have been rising a bit. They're pretty flat. Most people think they will peak either in the next few years, certainly by the end of the decade, which is what they've committed to. India's are going further up, that's absolutely true. But globally, most people think peak emissions year globally will likely be in the next decade or so, and then we've got a long mountain to climb down on the other side. But I mean, I was going to say, so yeah, the conception that we are the only people doing this and we're wearing hair shirts and the rest of the world are happily emitting away, this is not true. The entire world has agreed to do this at different speeds, no doubt, but poorer countries have a lot less money to spend on this than we do.
So it's expensive. That's the key.
Not as
It's an
expensive as
economic
not
cost.
doing it, though.
Precisely.
And also, the reason we're doing this isn't just for decarbonisation. A lot of these things are actually much nicer. You talk about hair shirt. Have you driven an EV? They're just much nicer to drive. They're also much faster.
And
I love my petrol
That's
car.
not true.
Great.
Well, if you want to drive a noisy, smelly, slow car, you go for it.
not
I'm
slow.
going to have my nice, cheap, lovely EV.
EVs are
Old.
not
Sorry.
popular.
I want to leave time for some audience questions, so if my colleagues can run to the mics, and hands are already shooting up. I've got one question first, Claire, for this side, because I think a lot of people's issue with the drive to net zero, whether it's right or wrong, is the perception that it is costing jobs. So you've mentioned Port Talbot several times on this side. I'm from Scunthorpe. We have a steelworks as well, possibly not for very much longer. There is a perception that, and to some extent a reality, that high energy costs are driving British manufacturing sectors overseas. It's costing jobs in the north, in the areas that need industry most. What would you say very quickly is your response to that?
Bring back Liz Truss. More markets is the response to that. We could have been more conservative in power. We could have much more marketisation in energy, and it would bring our energy costs down to some of the lowest in Europe. The places where we have the most renewable power, for example in Scotland, at the moment we struggle to get it all down south, partly because we haven't built enough grid. It'd be really nice to have more cable factories as well. That's a bunch of jobs we could bring in. But we could make the energy in those areas so much cheaper if we delinked our prices from being national. I think a lot of us in this room would say that Europe having exactly the same energy prices all as one block would not be a great idea. So why do we enforce that right across the UK? So one of the things we could do is import more markets and allow consumers and businesses to respond to those price signals.
Okay. I've only got 15 minutes and I want to finish on time. So, hands up. I'm going to try and take two at a time because it might be quicker if we start with Alex and then the lady in front of Max. Is that okay?
Hi there, Alex Stafford, former MP in a red wall seat along with Jacob. The question surely is not which is actually better, but which is more secure. And as we saw with the crisis in Ukraine, that really pushed up fossil fuel prices, which then impacted our bills. Surely the question we need to ask ourselves is about storage, whether it's building more gas storage or leading more to battery and then ultimately hydrogen storage to make sure we shouldn't be paying money for wind turbines that we're not using, but we should be storing any excess energy. And no government, including the last Conservative government, hasn't really embraced the storage side to make sure we have those reserves in hydrogen that we can do.
And then the lady in front of you as well.
Thanks. Amory Wilkinson, Star Energy. There is a midway here, isn't there, surely? I mean, Ed's ideology race for 2030 is about to cost the North Sea a huge amount of jobs. Surely we can come together. Fossil fuels are not finite. We can do this together if we work together. So where is that cross-party, that look to the future that we can actually bring this to happen? We can get to net zero, but not now, not in this race.
Okay, so security, not cost, and focusing on storage, and can we work together? Anyone want to start?
Can I just... I'm a believer in markets, and like Daisy, I think markets are excellent, but at the moment there are no markets, not proper markets in the energy sector. And interestingly, on storage, we did have, as you know, the rough, huge storage facility which we abandoned. Storing hydrogen, by the way, is a very different animal. Hydrogen's a very hard gas to manage. It leaks out, it's light, it's low density, it's not something... But storing gas, I think, it's very sensible indeed. But just to mention, we have a great deal of gas, it appears, under the Bowland Basin in Lancashire. We can get it out if we want to do fracking.
Except the frackers don't want to.
Well, they do if we got rid of the regulatory controls.
If we allowed them to, they'd absolutely love to.
Absolutely.
I know Alex and I don't completely agree on fracking, but it is our huge...
And if you imagine that fracking is a sort of marginal issue, I just point you to America, which until 15 years ago was the world's largest importer of energy. It is now the world's largest exporter of energy. Quite extraordinary. All fracking. They started with gas, and suddenly they discovered they were fracking oil. They are now exporting LNG extraordinarily to Europe. And this is all technology and all markets. That's markets. That's how markets work. If we just lifted every regulation and said, usual rules, don't kill people, don't have them die of the diseases which you claim, which, by the way, I would dispute heavily on air quality, you will discover that we've got plenty of gas, and if we get one of those gas spikes because we have a Ukrainian invasion again, then not only would consumers have to pay more, and I don't believe in price caps because I believe in markets, also we would make a great deal of money out of fracking, which would be great, so it would all be domestic. So enough of that.
Jacob, very quickly.
I would add on fracking that we already do fracking in this country. I had an oil company come to explain this to me. You're allowed to frack down to about a couple of 100 feet, but if you go a mile down, you're not. It's absolutely bonkers. So we frack to get oil out, but we don't frack more deeply to get gas out. The regulations are crazy. The seismic stuff is massively exaggerated. You have something under 2 on the Richter scale, and people think it's the San Francisco earthquake. And that's because the Richter scale is not really, well,
it's
people haven't been taught logarithms properly at school for decades. Rishi was right. We should learn maths till we're 102. And then we might all understand logarithmic scales, and then we would understand that the Richter scale, it does not mean that fracking makes everything fall down. On the middle way, we want to make sure we have cheap energy, and I don't really mind how we get it.
I do. On the storage point, I fully agree. That is the sort of one of the key questions: is how will we back this up, and critically, how will we back this up in the cheapest way? One thing I was actually going to be nice to agree with Neil on is that I agree that we have been far too statist in our approach over the last 10 years or so. It worries me that while we have competition between projects within a certain technology, we don't have very much competition between the different technologies for who is going to supply that capacity. And to me, that should be a question that markets should answer rather than some civil servant in DESNES running a bunch of models and then saying, haha, this will be the technology and so much capacity. And frankly, to the cross-party point, on the one hand, it's actually remarkable how much consensus we've had in the UK about the need to decarbonise. I grew up in the United States. We don't have the consensus there. It's not fun. So, I mean, in that sense, it's good that both parties tend to agree that we should be doing this. And yet, I actually think we should try to draw a dividing line between us and the Labour Party and differentiate ourselves and say, we don't want the state making all these decisions. We want markets to be making as much of these decisions as possible. And ultimately, if we can show people that will be cheaper and more consumer-led, I think that's a much more compelling vision of decarbonisation than King Ed making all the decisions himself.
And if I can build on that point about the politics of this, I know it's clear there's some of you in the room who are really frustrated by the fact there is mostly a consensus on this issue. And someone raised earlier the point about reform voters. Unfortunately, for this argument, they're kind of irrelevant because all the polling shows that most of the people who left the Conservatives to vote reform did so because of immigration, and net zero was largely irrelevant to that political decision. What we do know on the other end is that some of the people who left the Conservatives in order to vote for the Lib Dems and Labour were motivated by net zero, because despite the excellent work of the last Conservative government on reaching 50% of the net zero target, we decided to talk that down for the last 2 years of our government, which was a slightly self-sabotaging decision. To your point on security, yes, in spades, and that is one of the reasons why I think the last 4 years have been really salutary in this case, in that one of the things that people really care about when you talk to focus groups of real people is security, but also consistency. They want to know how much their energy bill is going to be. And the volatility of international markets, which we will be increasingly beholden to, partly because the gas in the North Sea is running out, we're running out of coal. Fracking, for all that it seems like a great idea, and I'm very open to it, in fact, it's problematic because most of the companies that were keen to do it now say that they don't think there's much down there and it's going to be really hard to extract. So I don't think it's the saviour it has been in America, which has different geology to us. The North Sea Basin is winding down. The jobs there have been declining even before you start talking about the windfall tax. So security of supply is where can we get our own energy? We know what's great about living on a small island on the edge of a big sea is we have quite a lot of wind, water and occasional sunshine. But also solar panels have got better, so that's nice. So we can grow our own energy here. We can provide it at a consistent price. One of the downsides of that is you do have to guarantee them slightly higher pricing. It's an insurance policy. We all pay insurance. So yes, if you want consistent, secure energy, you grow it at home.
Okay. Questions? The gentleman at the back and then the lady at the back. Sorry, that one.
Thank you. I suppose this is mainly for Daisy, but on the subject of electric vehicles, are you aware that their batteries need cobalt, which is mined using child slave labor in the Congo, so they're not sort of ethical at all?
Okay.
Okay.
Hold on. Sorry, we'll take
One more
let-
question.
Take another question.
Lady at the back. You. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I have all kinds of problems with net zero, including the concept itself, because I think if we tick the accounting boxes for net zero, I don't think it will benefit the environment substantially at all. But what I'd like to say is, I think we're measuring the wrong thing. I think assuming we are concerned about climate change and warming, which I think most of us are, including myself, what we should be measuring is the carbon footprint of each human being, and we aren't. We're just measuring carbon. And we also are focused on carbon emissions rather than the other pollutants which contribute to climate change, such as water vapor when it's emitted high up, such as carbon black, which comes from car brakes and all kinds of other combustion activities. So we are not providing a proper background to how we're decarbonising the grid. I have real concerns about scaling up electrification, batteries, electric cars, because it simply doesn't work. We have to think of something else, and I'd like to hear what the panel thinks the real answers are.
Thank you. Daisy, do you want to go first?
Yes, first of all, I just agree on so much of that. We have some points of contention in there, but I completely agree there's a whole load of other pollutants that we're not concentrating on enough, and there's so much work still to be done on measurement. Perhaps you and I should pick up afterwards about net zero more broadly, really happy to do that. Batteries and cobalt, let me take those two together though. First of all, do you drive an ICE car?
ICE?
Internal
Petrol or
combustion
diesel?
engine?
Yes.
Oh, that's got cobalt in it as well. Does that make your car more unethical, or is your car unethical because when you burn it, it creates particulate matter that kills people, or because we import most of that oil from regimes that are not very nice to people either?
I'm a proud gas guzzler.
Excellent. Well, the next generation of batteries mostly have been engineered not to involve cobalt, and increasingly we're also going to be recycling those batteries. So the cobalt will not mostly be coming from those bad places. But you're right, there are real problems in the supply chain. There's also problems in the supply chains for solar panels. And those are things we should all be working on, and I completely agree. But the problem with this argument is it affects the supply chains for fossil fuels as well. And in fact, fossil fuels involve far more extraction, and it's the extraction which creates more opportunities for problematic supply chains in and of itself. So in general, moving to a more electrified process involves less extraction per tonnage overall.
Can I also just say, on the per capita point, it's actually quite an interesting one. And yeah, you can measure carbon emissions in different ways, and people do, so one of the things that people in China will say is, on a per capita basis, our CO2 emissions are super low. And of course, in a country like the UK, per capita looks quite different. The problem is, ultimately, what matters for the atmosphere is the total amount of CO2 that we're putting into it. So for a small country that on a per capita basis may look good or bad, it doesn't really matter, right? Ultimately, globally, we have to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere, and per capita can be a good frame of mind or frame of reference to look at that problem, but that's ultimately not what actually matters for the planet.
Because you're not considering scope 3, which I am.
So trade point is also very well taken. Particularly, so yes, in the UK, if we're importing a lot of high carbon goods, that's not bad. And to Jacob's point, if all of our factories are closing down and we're just re-importing that steel, that's also bad for the planet. One of the things that we at the CPS has banged on about quite a bit is something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which is essentially a carbon tax at the border. And if you're importing that high carbon steel, you, the importer, need to pay a higher tax on that, and therefore we support our domestic industry, and so that we're not decarbonising by deindustrialising. And by the way, you want to know what really gets the Chinese talking about decarbonisation? Carbon border taxes, because they know suddenly they're going to have to face those when they import to Europe and the UK.
Wonder what the views on CBAM are on this.
Can I just...
Yeah, of course, yeah.
CBAMs are a dreadful idea that will make the poorest in this country poorer because they will put up the costs of all the goods that they end up using. The plan initially, I think, has 6 items that will be subject to the CBAM, but it will spread. We fought this battle, and Peel got it right in the 1840s when we took the tariff off corn. This is the same as putting a tariff on corn. Call it a CBAM, it's a tariff. It's an anti-free trade measure that will make us all poor. And it's done because we're making our own industry inefficient, we're putting it out of business. That's what protectionism always does. And all it does is protect weak businesses that should be able to compete, but they need to compete with low energy prices. CBAMs are a rotten idea, and it's essentially, as a side issue, a bit of a reversal of Brexit, because we seem to be going along with what the EU has decided, which is an even worse idea.
I agree with Jacob.
Can anyone promise me it's a very quick question? I've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes. This lady at the front, sorry. I realise I've said quick and picked the furthest person away from the microphone. I apologise.
Thanks. I'm Clem Cowton. I work at Octopus Energy. We worked very closely and constructively with Sir Jacob during the most recent gas crisis, when the operational cost of burning gas shot up to the point where the government had to pay £12 billion to subsidise that cost on our energy bills. We've been building houses which we have certified as zero bills homes. These are homes which are new homes, which have solar panels on the roof, battery storage, and a heat pump, aka an air conditioning unit. I'm so pleased to hear that you're a big fan of them, Jacob. I wouldn't consider that style of living to be hair shirt, but I'd be interested under what definition zero bills homes could be considered hair shirt. And I was also wondering, given that Octopus Energy was formed under a Conservative government and has grown in that time to be valued at $9 billion with investment from Australia, Japan, Canada, and the US, with 7,000 jobs in the UK, whether Sir Jacob is proud or ashamed of that British company.
I think Octopus Energy is brilliant. They even gave me a pink octopus when I was Secretary of State. Though unlike Keir Starmer, I didn't get to keep the freebie. It got kept by the department. But no. Thank you. I think that if you have zero-cost energy houses, that's a market solution. And if people want to live in them, that's terrific. And I'm always proud of British businesses that go to a $9 billion market capitalisation, because they're working on a capitalist principle. And Octopus has been brilliant at working out where the money is in energy. Now, quite a bit of that's been coming from taxpayers, but that's what businesses do. That's not the fault of Octopus. That's the fault of taxpayers for voting in government's been willing to do it. So I'm full of admiration for Octopus, and I would agree, you were wonderfully helpful during the energy crisis, so thank you for that.
Very quick.
And just very quickly, I, like Jacob, have no argument with well-insulated houses. It's just that we've got a relatively elderly housing stock in the UK, and insulating old houses is extremely expensive and only worth doing if your energy is very expensive, and we're just trying to argue that we don't want to have very expensive energy.
We could very easily go on for another hour, but unfortunately we need to clear out so that Tom Tugendhat can come in. I would just say, though, that our panel following Tom at 4:30 is Boomers and Bust, Building a Conservatism for the Young, where I imagine this issue may well come up again. But I would like to thank you all very much for coming and join you in thanking the panel.